All right, this is my talk, making web development or development workflow simple. But let me first introduce myself. My name is Peter. I'm this guy on the internet. You can find me on Twitter here, and I occasionally blog like every half year or something on this address. I've been in web development. I've tinkered for 18 years. I've professionally worked in web development for 12, 13 years or something. So I would guess I'm a senior by now. I live in Copenhagen. I am a co-organizer of Copenhagen JS, which is a monthly meetup group. If you're ever around in Copenhagen, please look us up, come visit, come speak even. That would be nice. I work at a company called Citrix on a product called Podio, which is a very front-end heavy software as a service, social work collaboration tool. Lots of buzzwords there. Back to my talk, though. Making development workflows simple is a very abstract title. It maybe should have been more bold, so I'll give you the bold title. Transpiling is a problem. So this is the topic of my talk. And maybe to put a bit more nuance to it, transpilers are really, really awesome tools that enable us to express our ideas easier and more precisely, but setting up an automated workflow around them is kind of difficult. And the complexity is scaring newcomers away. So I invite you to remember the talk yesterday that Glenn had, which very eloquently explained why all the complexity is a problem. And this is kind of the core topic of my talk as well. So a transpiler, let's start with that. I want to make sure that everybody knows what a transpiler is. So I want to do like a hands-up exercise. But in this case, I want to see the hands up of everybody who thinks they've never used a transpiler. And don't be shy, I'm not going to make fun of you. So who has never used a transpiler? Keep your hands up, please. And then take your hands down when I mention a tool that you have used. SAS. OK. All right. So that's pretty much everybody has used a transpiler in here. There are many others, though. I have a whole long list that I was supposed to go through. But a transpiler, on a conceptual level, a transpiler is pretty simple. It takes some source code of one type, and it transpiles it into a source code of a different type. So we're working in web development, which means that the kind of source we're interested in is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But we sort of want to start over here with all the cool stuff where SAS is happening, and where ES6 is happening, and where React is happening, and all that stuff. So we want to be able to do these things, but we still want to be able to run it in the browser, and that's what a transpiler lets us do. Now, the reason this is a problem is because you need to set up things around it in order to cater for actually running this transpiler at the right time. And the specific reason it's a problem is because we're scaring the next generation that is on the way in. So Glenn talked about the newcomers. I'm talking about the newcomers. I chose this specific picture because it talks to me on a lot of different levels. For me, it is actually the next generation. This is a picture of youth. It is a picture of interest. It's a picture of learning. And it's a picture of diversity, or at least as diverse as it sort of gets in IT in Copenhagen. I wouldn't say we're a rich country. We pride ourselves of being world champions in IT if you listen to our politicians once in a while. The problem is, in Denmark, programming is not on any curriculum. It's not really taken seriously in education. And web development specifically is almost laughed at universities. And there are very few places where you can actually go and take a course about web development. And most of those will be stuck in the 90s. So what I see here is young people who are engaged in tinkering with the web in the only place where they can do that, which is a meetup set up by volunteers. So this is Coding Pirates. It's sort of similar to Coding Dojo. So these young kids come here and they learn by enthusiasts like you and me. So that inspires me. But in order to know how to make tools and make transpiling easy for this generation, for the next generation, and also for ourselves, we need to figure out what is the mental model. How do we perceive web development? And for me, web development is sort of a circle. So this is my mental model. Somewhere in this mental model, I have an editor. I write my things. I write the things to the file system. And eventually, I see the things in a browser. And this is my feedback loop So when I see things in the browser, I can figure out what works and what doesn't and edit. And you go around this loop, maybe if you're a really good developer, a few times. If you're a sort of mid-level developer, a few thousand times. But you will eventually get there, right? And this is, you go round and round and round, and you develop, and eventually you're done, right? So this is the mental model. It is also sort of the simplest model that I can come up with. There are no tools involved in this. You only use the browser, basically. And it's very important to note that the simpler the better, and the faster the better. The more things we jam into this model, the more tools that come in there, the more complexity we're adding, and potentially the more time spent we're adding. So we need to be very aware of what tools we actually plug into this development workflow, because this is your zone. This is where you're supposed to be completely immersed and have that intuitive feeling because of the immediacy. Brett Victor was quoted earlier today. He is definitely a guy who inspires me to improve tooling. So it all comes down to figuring out what does easy mean and what does simple mean. For me, in this case, easy is a subjective term. So that means after 18 years tinkering with web development, a lot of things are easy for me. I'm not brilliant, but I have a lot of experience. And if you just came into web development last week, not a lot of things are easy for you. On the other hand, simple is a completely different thing. Simple is the absence of anything that is not needed. It is the focus on only the thing that you want to achieve. So simple is much more subjective. And if we can make tools that are simple, then they will also be easy. And actually, simple tools are far preferable also by professionals and very experienced developers. So as an example of easy over here, so if I stand here, like easy would be a tool like Yeoman. How many people have used Yeoman before? All right, so Yeoman is easy because I can write a single command line and it'll just go ahead and generate a whole web application for me. It'll set up a workflow, it'll set up all the tools. You'll get a grunt file of 800 lines, maybe 1,000 lines if you're not that lucky. And it's definitely easy, but if anything goes wrong at all, then it's suddenly not so easy anymore because it's not so simple to see what's actually going on. On the other hand, a tool like AutoPrefixer is simple, because AutoPrefixer has made a big deal of removing any kind of configuration. You only configure it with one thing. What browsers do I need? And it is so simple and so well made that everybody can just plug it in any way. That is the model of the tooling I want for us for web development. So this whole mental model that I was talking about before, for me it sort of fits in the middle here. So before developing, you have sort of a planning phase. I do Scrum, so planning is a big thing. But also planning sort of involves bootstrapping for me. I do npm install, bower install, read a bunch of documentation in order to sort of prepare for my actual work. Then I go into the development loop and I keep looping around until I'm sort of satisfied. And in the end, my code comes out and I am ready to deploy it. And for me, transpiling fits here. It should be in the development loop. I want to state very explicitly, which might be a topic for another talk, that any sort of web performance optimization stuff, bundling, compression, all that stuff, is here. Do not put that thing in your tight loop. It adds complexity, it adds time. It fits here. And please ask me about this later, because I have a long, long rant for you. Okay, so back to the mental model. This is the basic model. This is what I can start with if the only thing I have is view source, which was how I started and how I actually prefer young people to start, because it is the simplest possible thing. Well, maybe not view source. Maybe you can use developer tools these days. They're actually better. But the next thing I recommend people to put in there is a web server, because eventually you will need to do some sort of XML HTTP request, or you will want to dabble around with the web audio or something, and you cannot do that on the file system, and there's all sorts of things. The web server in its purest form is just static, like Apache or Nginx or whatever, but it is a potential forward path to add a tool set which is actually helping a lot, which is live reload. And I really feel that adds a lot of value to the development workflow, because it, again, gives you the immediacy. It lowers the time it takes to get the feedback. and that makes it more intuitive to develop. So where does transpiling fit in all this? If you're using GRUNT or GULP, or more abstractly, any task runner, this is broccoli or brunch or whatever as well, it fits somewhere between the file system and the web server. So you write your files to disk, you run a task, maybe you have a watcher task, maybe it triggers automatically. But GRUNT or GULP will go in and say, okay, I have this source file, I want to transpile it into my target file, and now I have a build artifact. And build artifacts are desirable things because those are actually the things you want to run in your browser. But anybody who has run a project in version control will also know that build artifacts are probably not a thing you want on your disk, really. So people solve this problem by putting their build artifacts in a temporary folder. So I think a lot of Yeoman scaffolds are using .temp. So you have your SAS files over in your source folder, and you transpile them over to the .temp folder. So now you have a new problem, because you actually have a website in your source folder. You are pointing at a CSS file, which is probably some sort of URL that is source relative or root relative. The problem is that your web root is actually your source folder. So now you need to somehow include your CSS file from a folder that is not your source folder anymore, or not your web root. So how do you do that? And then the complexity starts. Now there are tasks to copy all the remaining files over to the temp folder. So now the temp folder is the authoritative thing, the source of truth for the browser. Alternatively, people, they mess with this part, with the web server, with middlewares, where they say, okay, I'm just going to have a server that knows that all CSS files will be read from the temporary directory, and anything else will be read from the source directory. Or they have things that say, okay, I'm always going to read from the temp directory, and if I get a miss on the file, then I'm going to read it from the source directory. And you can sort of hear that this is probably not the thing I would recommend trying to set up for a newcomer. It's kind of complex. On top of that, you have configuration files, tasks you need to figure out how they work, how to configure them, setting up watchers. There's all sorts of complexities with this. I think task runners are too complex to introduce newbies to the field, actually. So when I started with transpilers, the first one I used was less. And it had a cool feature which meant that it could run in the browser. Don't do that. That is the conclusion. There is one cool thing about running it in the browser, and that is it runs in a context where it has access to the things you need. So how this worked was you included the less file on your web page, and then less.js would go in and say, okay, what less files do I have on my page? And just figure them out, and then just say, okay, I'm going to download these and transpile them and add CSS style blocks or whatever with the CSS. The cool thing about this is it required almost no configuration. That's a big plus. So no glob patterns telling the task runner where your files are and where they should go and how to watch them and wiring up this whole thing. This is much simpler. Like, obviously, it's really, really bad because now your CSS is dependent on JavaScript, and that's not a thing that is really desirable. Also, it dies with, there's no caching, so you're not going to reuse it. You have to recompile every time. But there was one idea which was cool, which is there is a context, and if you can use the context in an optimal way, then you can reduce your configuration. So these days we have, maybe we don't have require.js that much anymore. I still have a require.js setup because I'm working on a legacy code base. I don't recommend starting with require.js if you're starting out now. Obviously, Glenn told us that system.js is really cool, and I wholeheartedly agree with him. This is the future for me. So if you are to start new people out, please point them at system.js. But they have a thing in common, which is that both of them are module loaders, which means that when they evaluate in the browser, they will figure out what do I need, and then they will load them. And this is a place where you can hook in. The plugins give you context where they know what file you're talking about, they know what type they are, and they will be able to transpile things on the way through the pipeline. But it suffers from the same problems as the less.js parser had, which is that you simply can't cache these things. And Glenn mentioned it as well. This thing might become slow eventually when you have 800 imports or 5,000 imports or whatever. So There are some good things in this. One of the good things is that if you are thinking ahead, if you're thinking about the deploy step that I had before here, these two actually give you, with the plugins, also give you the ability to create, do the transpiling in your build step, which means that you're able to do a static build without changing anything in your code. So that's a plus. This is a nice feature, and let's make a note of that. I want that in my optimal abstraction build tool in a minute. I also dabbled quite a bit with Express middleware, so kind of hooking into the web server. It has the same advantages of knowing the context, because you're actually, the browser is requesting the file, so I don't need to figure out where the files are. I have some more good things about this, because the web server is a longer running process, which enables you to actually do server-side caching. So you can do fewer compiles and just send the same thing over the wire again if it's re-requested. That's a plus. And I had one more thing. I just need to, this is important, so I just need to look up my notes. All right, and another thing that the web server can do is that, given the context and given its knowledge of where things are on the disk, it can actually be instructed to set up file watching automatically. So there's yet another thing that you would need to say, tell GULP or GRUNT where the things are and what to watch, which can happen completely automatically in the middleware. The problem is that there's no build artifact on disk, which means that it's kind of hard to hook in your build system on this. So for me, so far this has been sort of the best abstraction I could find that required the least amount of knowledge of the system and sort of just works. But it has the problem of the missing build artifact. And if we go down here, where the task runners live, they have the build artifacts, but they have a lot of negatives also. So I'm trying to figure out how do I figure out this mess? Like, what are the options? How can I make this better? And I thought about making an editor plugin, but the editor plugin has an amazing amount of problems. First of all, like I have no idea how to write Python or Ruby or whatever, Java or whatever editors are written in. Also, if I make this, I need to make 1,000 plugins and not just one, because otherwise I need to force people to use that editor, and that's just not feasible. So don't do that. So what the heck can I do? And I couldn't figure it out because I had all these tools. I have a lot of knowledge about build tools, and I felt that I had all of these abstracts, which are quite easy to use. Like transpilers are easy to use. Caching is well documented. It's not that hard to implement. And all these things were actually available, but I was missing something. And then I talked to Matthias Boos, who is also living in Copenhagen and doing the tours at a lot of conferences and talking about, this is one of his projects, Torrent Mount. And there is a really, really cool thing that Torrent Mount can do. It is a torrent client, so you can find a torrent of a legal video, and you can give this torrent link to Torrent Mount. And what it does is it starts a torrent client, and then it mounts a fake directory on your disk. And from then on, this directory looks exactly like your file system, and inside it you find all the files that are available in the torrent. And immediately as you have mounted this, when you have downloaded 0 kilobytes of this torrent, you can take a video player and point it at the file and then say, please play this. And it just works. Like the torrent client goes and streams things in, so you can actually stream this video in. This is how Popcorn Time works. And Popcorn Time is actually using some of his stuff behind the scenes. So that's how that works. And then the cool thing comes, because then you say, oh, okay, this video is an hour long, I'm going to press right in the middle of it, and then it's suddenly going to break, right? Because torrent clients will download things in the order that they will. But no. Because he has this file system, he is able to intercept the concept of a file read, figure out where, in what range he's reading, and then take that knowledge, re-instruct the torrent client to get the things that are here. And then from then on, it just takes a while, and then it switches over to stream those parts, and then you can watch the video. So he's basically treating this as a slow network file system. But what dawned on me was that he can intercept things. Like he can know what's being read from the file system. So is that the missing part, maybe, that I need? So first of all, when I heard this, like, yeah. So is this the abstraction? Is this the place where we can hook in? Where we can know whenever people are reading the files, that we can actually transpile them on the fly? And I kind of think it is. Because the cool thing about these file systems is that they're actually sort of a RAM disk. It's an in-memory file system, and when you unmount it, it's gone. So the only problem I had with the Express middleware, which has sort of the same setup, which knows about the context and what's being requested, the only problem I had was there were no build artifacts on disk, which means I couldn't use other tools on my build artifacts. But if I have a file system, if these things are available, I can use my other tools as well. So I've only mentioned CSS as a target, but it gets much, much more interesting when we're talking about JavaScript, because CSS is mainly consumed by the browser, but JavaScript is consumed by a lot of tools. So definitely the browser, but it's also consumed by your build system. It's consumed by your linter, your tests, and all sorts of things. So this is the reason why every test framework has to create a plugin framework, because I might want to run Babel when I run Mocha, and then I need to instruct it how to transpile before it runs Mocha. But if I can transpile before, then I don't need that. And then all subsequent tools can become simpler, because they can just assume that the thing is actually the source that it expects. So I went ahead and implemented this. Not entirely, but I have a demo, and I want to show you this. If I can not throw this down. All right. So I'm in a directory. Can you read this in the back? Yeah? OK, right. I'm in a directory, in a demo directory. Let's pretend that this is my project root, and the source folder is where my web application resides. In this case, I have a hello world component .jsx and .scss, so I'm doing React and Sass. And I can show you the content of these. So the React component is using ES6 features, it's using const, it's using let, it's using decorators and JSX, obviously. So there are things here that won't work in all browsers. And similarly, if I show you the Sass file, it uses variables, and it uses calculations, and it uses things that probably should be auto-prefixed. The transform is missing a WebKit prefix. And these are all things that would be really, really nice to enable newcomers to actually do, because currently they have to do this whole GRUNT and GULP thing, like, in order to just get the one thing they need. And Glenn was mentioning the ability to do incremental complexity. So if I only want the ability to transpile and don't even have a web server in my setup, that would be pretty nice if I could do this. So this is what FUSILE does. So FUSILE exposes a binary called FUSILE. I can tell it, this is my source directory, and please mount a directory that's called compiled. And then it starts up, and it says, oh, I loaded these transpilers. I have loaded a lot of transpilers because these are installed on my system already. Yes, Doggy script is a part of this. OK, so this is running as a daemon. I can stop it with Control-C. And if you're able to see it down here, there's a little icon telling me that something just mounted a file system. So I switch over here. I'm in the same directory. And now I have a source folder, and I have a compiled folder. This is interesting already, but I might just be faking it, right? Because this is quite easy. This might just be a copy operation. So let's take a look at it. So let's take a look at the Sass file first. It's actually still called SCSS. So this is a work in progress. I'm not renaming file extensions yet. But let's have a look at this. This is CSS. This is a hello world component. It has evaluated the math, the variables. It has done auto-prefixer for me automatically, and it has done source mapping for me. Like, it's the baseline that you want to have and don't want to deal with. You should always do source mapping in development. If you want to remove your source maps when you go into deployment, you do it in your deployment step. So this is the thing that newcomers need. But not only newcomers, I need it as well. Like, it simplifies a lot of things for me. And I can show you similarly hello world component.jsx. Oh, that's a bit. So this was using const and let, and these are now vars, and the JSX has been compiled into React Create element, and there's source mapping. So this works. This is how it works. I don't think I have time to go into details, but you generally start over here on the far end, and it basically checks, do you have a transpiler for this file that you're reading? If no, it just passes through to the original file system. If it does, then it goes through a whole thing of, is it cached? If it's not cached, then transpile it, and then send the thing through, and if it's CSS, then please auto-prefix it. You end up with a buffer, and you stream the buffer out. So this is your file read. It's not that complex. It's sort of what you would implement if you implemented a similar thing in GULP. It's very comparable. So this is the project. Oh, let me remove this. It's called FUSILE. It's on my GitHub account. I have released it on NPM, but it's in a very early stage. But you can use it and you can dabble around with it if you want to. And definitely, if you're interested, do this and give me bug reports. It has an MIT license and it is not stable. So it says use it at your own risk, but I would definitely say do not use this yet. So the future of this project, I have no idea. It started out as a crazy idea. I think this hits the right abstraction, like the abstraction I've been missing for a long, long time. It moves the transpiling down to the lowest level possible that I know how to access at least, and it's a non-leaky abstraction. There's a lot of the task runners currently that have leaky abstractions in the thing where they need to cater for file watching or for source control or for all sorts of other things that are not really relevant to the transpiling. But I think this sort of hits home base, and the FUSILE itself is a god-awful mess right now, but of only about 400 or 500 lines. So it's actually not that bad, and I will eventually clean it up when I start splitting things up again, right? Performance, I have no idea. I need to test these things, obviously. Stability, not that good yet. It's going to be interesting to see if it will become stable. If it handles big loads and like 5,000 file reads at a time. And then there's the obvious question, Windows support, because if I want to cater for newcomers, probably telling them to use Mac or Linux is not so friendly, again. I actually have no idea about Windows support. Oh, I do specifically know that Fuse, which is the technology I'm using, does not work on Windows, period. If this turns out to work and be really, really good, then Windows is able to mount a file system type that's called Samba. And I would assume that some node hacker out there has made a wrapper, and maybe this thing can be ported. The future will show. But I want to end on a note of, on pretty much the same note as Glenn did, that it's important to keep questioning why we're doing things, and it's important to think about the next generation. So basically have empathy with the people who once were newbies and were learning things, because I'm one of the lucky ones. I can remember how that was, and every time I see tooling and see people saying, oh, this is the new easy thing, Webpack, Babel, blah, 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 all I think is, okay, so how many lines of configuration do I need? Because that's just, it's really, really big. And I think we owe it to the next generation and also to ourselves to keep thinking about simplicity and getting to the point where we can remove no more. And those are the tools we should focus on building. And what comes with it is that they're extremely adaptable and extremely interoperable. This is a file system. Anything you use today can read from this. So this is really cool. I'm Peter. This is my Twitter account, my blog, and that's all I had. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so your tool looked pretty cool for one-to-one file transforms, but in the real world, of course, there isn't always such a simple case. Like, for example, you could have a project that has, for example, with SAS, you could have multiple exports, which would create a complicated structure, and even you could, as a part of the build process, pull in dependencies like, I don't know, downloading Bootstrap with Bower and PM and wanted to include it. How would that thing
So now you're talking about the preparation step, right? Because this is not what you're doing in your tight loop. I hope you're not pulling in Bootstrap in your normal development loop and doing it every time you update a file.
Well, not with every, not every time you refresh the browser, but for example, when talking about build tool, I kind of think about it like someone should be able to like download, fork the project, or clone it into a repository and just run one tool.
Is there a question? Because I'd really like to answer multiple questions if it's possible. I can't hear a question I can answer. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. So the question was, how do you think would it look like in a more complicated case?
Yeah. So for SAS it's easy, right? Because it has imports. So one SAS file might have 5,000 imports, but all you're consuming is the main file, and the main file, by giving it to the SAS compiler, it pulls in the things. So you only need to start it out with what your browser consumes, and then your browser basically starts reading these things. It tells the web server to fetch it, the web server looks on the file system, and then you get these things compiled. So it actually completely works out as long as you have a dependency graph that works. And don't do assembly like template stuff in your normal workflow. I just recommend not to do it. But I have another talk on that eventually. I don't like people who do too much work in the development loop, basically.
So I'm just wondering which language you use to develop your project.
Which language is it implemented in?
Yes.
This is implemented in Node.js. So obviously, even though I'm talking about simplicity, it requires that you install Node, and most OS X installations don't come with Fuse out of the box. So there is you need to do one thing before this works. But the install instructions are in the README. Eventually, somebody will come along, hopefully, and make an easy tool like Glenn also showed us, where he had the I can just create a file server or a web server by pointing at a directory. This could easily be wrapped eventually. So hopefully it will become simpler. But it's Node, and there are Node bindings for Fuse. And if you're interested, then I definitely recommend diving into it. It's Matthias who's maintaining those, the ones that I'm using as well.
Yes. Okay. When you mentioned the C++, when you mentioned the Fuse, I was betting that it's C++ that you use. But
I'm really sorry, I can't understand you.
Okay, so I was betting that it's C++ that you use for your project. But because of Fuse.
So Fuse is written in C++, but I'm using the Node bindings, which means that it's potentially going to slow things down a bit. I don't know how much.
Okay, so thank you very much.
There's a question over here.
John? Oh, yeah. One question. You said you want to remove the configuration. But how would you go upon configuring, for example, the auto prefixer? Because you need this one line to configure it.
Yeah.
Where do you put it?
So obviously, it's a lie. There will eventually be configuration if you want to do special things like passing options into Babel. I will need to expose an interface for that, and I haven't at the moment because I'm prototyping. But when you look at the configuration of GULP and GRUNT, for example, about 80% of the configuration has to do with file paths. And that is the configuration that 100% completely disappears when you do this. And I'm very much leaning towards, if I want to configure the individual transpiler, I'm leaning towards not having one configuration file, which is the FUSILE configuration, but just having JSON files per transpiler, and then verbatim copying, sending it into the tool, which means that you don't need to understand how FUSILE is configured. You can just go and read the README of Babel or of SAS or something, and just put it in a JSON file, and then it'll work. I'm hoping to get to that point.
Okay, thanks, Peter.